Since I don't know at least a third and maybe half of you, I'm usually, when we're here, we lead a fairly peripatetic ministry. I'm sitting over there wearing a bow tie. But Pete Powell, been a member here for a very long time. And when they ask me to do something, I usually do it. So today you get me. I will... It's always dangerous to say something to me in the sacristy, so I've been urged to add more good news to the sermon. I'm not sure how to do it. I thought it was all good news, but I will keep that in the back of my mind. It's an interesting text this morning, so you may want to open up your bulletin to keep the gospel before you so you can see what I think I'm talking about. The gospel ends with the verses that in the gospel today show that Mark had no idea what parables were. The last line is, with many such parables he, Jesus, spoke the word to them as they were able to hear it. He did not speak to them except in parables, but he explained everything in private to his disciples. In other words, we have come to believe, and clearly Mark believed, and Matthew and Luke, that the parables are mysteries which must be unpacked to make sense of them. I doubt that is what Jesus intended. I think what Jesus intended was the parables that they be absolutely clear to the people who heard them. They were his sermon example. They were to drive home the thought. They were to say, oh, if it's just like that, I understand. But unfortunately, when the gospel traveled, when Christianity traveled away from Judah and Galilee, from Palestine, especially agricultural metaphors went with them because there were different ways of growing things in different places. And the parables continued and remained impenetrable, so much so that countless doctorates and much exegetical ink has been spilled over figuring out what the parables mean, and almost all of it is nonsense. The scholarly literature on parables is huge, but recent work is bringing it under control. The men's discussion group has taken a suggestion of mine, and maybe the women's spirituality group want to also, to read a book by a feminist Jewish New Testament scholar, Amy Jill Levine, Short Stories by Jesus. Levine teaches New Testament at Vanderbilt, and she is increasingly one of the leading scholars on understanding the synoptic gospels. So think about that. Feminist, well, we got some of them. New Testament Jewish scholar. So she comes in with different eyes. What she does is just fantastic. Much mischief has been played in the interpretation of the two parables we have today. The first is the parable of the seed growing by itself in the field and producing a yield without the farmer doing much more than planting it. And the second, and better known, is the parable of the mustard seeds. Scholars have earned many doctorates and spilled much exegetical ink coming up with creative and ultimately useless interpretations of both parables. Levine shows us that at the simplest and most profound level, these are very simple statements. As she writes, to speak of the parable as demonstrating that great outcomes arrive from small beginnings is correct, but banal. Now, I've just used one of the words where I'm growing out on a limb on. I almost never use that word because I'm never sure whether it's banal or banal. So if you think it's the other way, it's like I am absolutely sure that schism is schism, but everybody's saying schism today. I think they're schismatic in saying it that way. But I love a scholar like Levine who points out the obvious, that when we simplify it, we come out with something that's trivial. So to go beyond the trivial or the banal, she says that we must focus on what outcomes must occur. Jesus assumes that we know something about the mustard plant. I don't know about you, I love mustard, I know nothing about the plant. To take only the second parable and realize that it is a highly useful annual that produces more than one person or even one family will need of its product. She goes on to note that the planting of the seed is important, Something has to be done. She then calls attention to the fact that some things must be left alone, and that for many things to succeed, we must get out of the way. Finally, she calls us to recognize that Jesus was asking us to put aside our lust for big-time successes and instead focus on doing the part we can do. So if you have the Gospels open in your bulletin, see if that makes any sense when you read the second parable of the mustard seed. What can we do? We can plant a seed and let it grow without our pulling it up by the roots to see if it's actually growing. What is the message for today's church? It seems to me that today's church, especially today's Episcopal church, but not solely the Episcopal church, has lost sight of this profound, if small, truth. Recently, many of the clergy of this diocese got together and learned, among other things, about the work of the task force to reimagine the Episcopal Church. The reimagining is happening on both the national and diocesan level, and many are proud of the results. Much of the upcoming General Convention will be focused on the work of the task force, and much of the work is important and needs to be done. For instance, does the Episcopal Church today need a headquarters at 815 2nd Avenue? Or might we be better served by a headquarters someplace else where the cost of living is lower? For instance, does the Episcopal Church need to revise its marriage canons to accommodate gay marriage as equivalent to straight marriage? Or will this drive away our conservative members, if we have any left? Do we need provinces? You may not even know that we have provinces, but we do. And in Connecticut, do we need deaneries? Since Easter, I have heard 5 presentations, each essentially the same, on the work of the task force in the diocese and in the wider church, and I am impressed by all of the hard work done by so many for so long. I also think it is entirely beside the point. The temptations in institutions, and we are, if nothing else, an institution, but I hope that's not all we are, is to worry about process. Everything I've heard from those who shared passionately about the need to reimagine has left me dispirited. To return to the parables, we are about planting seeds. That is our task. No one becomes a Christian, an Episcopalian, a priest, to be better at process. But it appears because evangelism is so hard, we'd rather talk about process than about making more Christians, or about planting more seeds, or about being the church in the world and transforming the world. We don't want to leave the plant alone. We want to pull it up and be certain it's growing, and this, of course, kills it. Much work has been done to show that our world has changed irrevocably from the so-called good old days of the 50s and 60s, when the churches were full and the thought was that a growing church had a bowling alley or a gymnasium. In fact, I've been part of a couple of churches that had gyms. Believe me, they had no idea what to do with them now. At Christ and Holy Trinity, we had neither a bowling alley nor a gym, but we used to have in the Undercroft a shuffleboard court. So I guess we had a Yankee response to that. I especially recommend the work of the late Robert Bella, an Episcopalian. He edited 2 books that are relevant to understanding how things have changed theologically. The first was Habits of the Heart, wrote that in the mid-'80s, and then in the early '90s, The Good Society. They are a long discussion about how the church has become less relevant. More recently, the seminal work of Robert Putnam and David Campbell. Robert Putnam wrote Bowling Alone. Their work on the church is called American Grace, has shown how mainstream churches, and we are as mainstream as they get, have become less relevant to people as they are no longer seen as the place you come to impart the American way, or to find a spouse, or maybe make business connections. Quite simply, the church is not, and has not been for some years, the social center of most, if not all, American communities. I would argue that when it was a social center, it was rarely about preaching the gospel, and more frequently about imparting a set of helpful cultural values. So that, for instance, when I say, as some of you have heard me say, that in the Episcopal Church, there is only one sin, and that is to be tacky, I'm not saying anything positive about us. It's much easier to be Episcopalian than to be Christian. I wish that what I was hearing was that the role of the church, to paraphrase the words of a colleague after one of these task force presentations, is meant to be like that of a vacuum cleaner stirring up the world so that people want to become part of us and get pulled up into the bag of the vacuum cleaner. The metaphor breaks down, but he was very proud of it. Now we can argue about the appropriateness of the vacuum cleaner, and I think he was a little embarrassed as the metaphor for the church, but at least it says that we must be involved in the nitty-gritty of life. Instead, far too meetings I attend for clergy are focused on the lack of job opportunities for young clergy. We note that most churches that had 2 or more clergy in the 80s and 90s now have 1. Many churches that always had a full-time rector since Jesus was a young boy now have a part-time priest in charge. We lament the loss of employment opportunities for young clergy and worry that we are condemning them to a career with few chances of advancement. In other words, we do not talk about the gospel, we talk about the institution. On Trinity Sunday, our rector explained the Trinity as being defined by connections, and she threw ribbons all around. And she asked us to think about our role in Westport and how we can be the connection. I'm paraphrasing her, and I hope I have it right. If I understood her point, I think it bears taking seriously. We need to be the connections. Why are you here? What do you hope to get out of it? How do you talk about it when you leave here? In 1972, as part of the screening before I was admitted to the ordination process, I had to meet with a psychologist. He asked me if I felt called, and I did. Then he asked how I experienced that call. He said, "Did God speak to you?" Had I said that God had spoken to me, I would have been flushed out of the process immediately. We were much too rational to think that God spoke to anybody other than schizophrenics. Fortunately for my future, especially in the church, at that time I too was much too rational, and it would not have occurred to me to say that God spoke to me. Instead, I talked about my love of the church and my involvement in it throughout my life. I'm a cradle Episcopalian. I don't think Jesus got a mention, and since I had never read the Bible, I know that the Gospels did not get a mention. I was not unique. Church was safe, it was familiar, and I felt called to be part of church. Somehow in the years since then, I discovered the gospel and it changed my life. I hope it's changed your life. I hope we can make it real to the 2 children we baptized this morning. I wish we talked about it more. We don't. Instead, we talk about process. I can assure you that there are very few of your neighbors who are interested in joining Christ and Holy Trinity or the Episcopal Church because we have a good process. They join because they have a need to understand the spiritual calling they may feel, or the spiritual emptiness they may be experiencing, or the spiritual longing they have for meaning. In other words, they join to have their God-shaped hole filled. Process doesn't do the trick. Proclaiming the gospel does. So where does that leave you and me? Quite simply, we should be about the task of planting seeds, which means that we should be talking with our friends and neighbors about what is exciting at Christ and Holy Trinity and invite them to be part of it and make connections. We should be willing to share how this community and this faith in Christ has sustained us through illness, divorce, unemployment, boredom, marriage, child rearing, death of parents or spouses or children, birth, failure, success, and everyday life. Most of us don't, and therefore the seed never gets planted. If the seed never gets planted, the shrub never grows, and the good things it might do never happen. I hope you will be here throughout the summer to learn what it means to carry the gospel to the communities in which we find ourselves. Unfortunately, I will not be. I will be in 5 different churches from now till Labor Day, and none of them are air-conditioned. 6 churches if you count today, which is air-conditioned. In each, I'll find the most faithful, because one mark of being faithful is coming to church on Sunday in the summer. I hope that you and the people I will preach to this summer will grow in confidence and love, so that you and I can plant a few seeds and get the mustard plant underway. Amen.